Putin has come up with these red lines before on F-16s and tanks and, HIMARS artillery, and we've crossed those red lines. And what has Putin done? Nothing. So he's a bit of a paper tiger, and he'll use rhetoric to try to deter us. But in reality, we can go ahead. And in any case, if Ukraine is going to win, it means taking more risks. There's no way around that. And that Ukraine has sort of shown that it's very good at attacking targets deep inside Russia, linked with the Russian military campaign. Fuel dumps, some spectacular explosions against ammunition dumps in recent days, striking at airfields, destroying Russian aircraft and bombers on airfields. All of the kind of things that make it harder for Russia to keep the offensive going.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General. Jamie, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you again for inviting me, James.
Let's begin with last week's UN General Assembly in New York and President Zelensky's victory plan. He was trying to convince his allies in the West to support it. Obviously, we don't know the specifics of it, although we have a fair idea. We'll come on to some of the planks of it in a moment. But in brief, do you think he was successful in trying to sell this plan last week?
Well, I think what happened, James, is that he was trying, of course, to put the attention back on Ukraine when the focus overwhelmingly of the UN General Assembly, unsurprisingly, was the situation in Gaza, the Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think he at least managed to create a little bit of space for himself. His speech at the General Assembly, obviously bilateral meetings, he met Biden, he met Harris. He also, and I think this was probably most important of all for him, managed to have a meeting with President Trump, and at least try to convince Trump to be more supportive of the cause of Ukraine. And he came out of that meeting in Trump Tower in New York saying that, Trump was supportive of Ukraine. We'll wait to see if that's truly the case. So I think, it was a good effort by him at least to sort of pull the spotlight back over onto Ukraine. Not easy at the moment. When it comes to his sort of peace plan, yes, okay, you're right. We haven't had the whole thing sort of published yet, but from the sources that did sort of leak out, it became pretty clear that it wasn't what maybe some people were expecting, a sort of let's go and negotiate now with the Russians, and here are the territorial concessions that we're prepared to make. This is what we want from Russia. It was more a rehash of his so-called 10-point plan that he issued last year, which is really a kind of pathway to victory rather than a territorial negotiation. It contains many of the familiar things. We need more weapons, we need more money, we need more NATO membership, we need those Russians that have committed war crimes to be brought to trial. We need more reconstruction money, and so on and so forth. So I think from that point of view, it didn't sort of show Ukraine yet being prepared to sort of compromise on its goal of liberating all of its territory and then negotiating beyond with Russia.
Yeah, can we go through what we think are kind of like the 5 planks of this victory plan? And you can just tell me, Jamie, whether you think this is viable, whether you think Ukraine is likely to get this. So the first one is a formal invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. Where do you think we are with that?
Well, the Allies have always said, since they first made the promise back in 2008, a long time ago, that Ukraine would be a member one day. They've always said that they're not backing away from that. The door is open. The language they used in the recent NATO summit in Washington last July was that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership. But I think it's pretty clear that nothing will happen before the war is over. It's very difficult for NATO to bring Ukraine in while the war is going on, because then Ukraine would trigger the Article 5 collective defense clause the day after, committing NATO to go to war with Russia. And you've seen the allies, but particularly the Biden administration, and of course the US is all important in all of this, is not willing to go down that particular path. The problem for NATO is that its collective defense works best in peacetime, in terms of being set up. You're at peace, and therefore you can put NATO soldiers in Ukraine. You can construct a system of deterrence, nuclear and conventional, to stop wars happening. But it's very difficult to construct that deterrent system in wartime, obviously. So I think, the membership of Ukraine is still a possibility, but not immediately, given that the war is going to go on. The second thing which I think happened at the NATO summit, is that the Biden administration started to talk about other things as well. Not just, Ukraine has to be interoperable with NATO. Obviously, it has to have an army capable of defending the country, meet its military requirements. The Biden administration started to sort of resurrect some old complaints about corruption in the public administration, a weak judiciary, for instance, more needed on economic reform, those kind of things. And of course, in wartime, those things are also difficult for Ukraine to achieve. And again, after the war, the danger is that if Ukraine relapses into some of those bad old habits, particularly connected with corruption, that could delay the process of NATO membership. So it's still there, but it's not something that I expect to happen this year or next.
And also, if those concerns are still there, that could potentially delay membership of the EU, which is another one of these planks, we believe, of this victory plan. Do you think that is any more or less likely than NATO membership?
Well, I think that the EU, in extending the sort of offer of membership to Ukraine and Moldova, Georgia, unfortunately, is lapsing backwards now and is in a different position. We'll see what happens with the Georgian elections in October. But I think the EU made a very bold move because it said now, that the EU should be consistent with all of Europe and no longer part of Europe and should embrace all of democracies. I think that is a very bold and irreversible step. But there are two big issues, of course. Number one is that the EU is now looking at Ukraine, which has less than half the GDP per capita of Poland, although they were mainly broadly equivalent back in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. So it's really dealing with a country which is massively poorer than the EU average. And so it's going to take a lot of EU funds and a lot of reform to get the Ukrainian economy somewhat approximate with some of the more recent EU members from Central and Eastern Europe. And agriculture, which is Ukraine's still major export economy, grain, could be a big advantage for EU food security. But you see already it's upsetting Polish farmers, it's upsetting farmers elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in the EU, who are putting barriers up to the import of cheaper Ukrainian grain. The second thing I think with the EU, James, is that you can't have now an EU which goes over 30 members in the future and with the same basic structures that it has at the moment. Decision making by unanimity, the way in which some of the EU funds are sort of shared out among the member states. There's a real keen sense here in Brussels that you need a new EU for a new Ukraine. For an EU with Ukraine. And how do you sort of combine that internal aspect of reforming so you're ready with what you're asking Ukraine to do? Some EU allies are saying, well, we should start this reform process right away so that we're ready to absorb these new members with a functional decision-making resource allocation system. Whereas you can imagine others are saying, no, we're not even sure that Ukraine's going to make the grade yet. This could run on for years. So let's postpone reform. No need to do it at the moment. Particularly, of course, those countries like Hungary, you can imagine, James, which really are very attached to unanimity in decision making, because then they can use this to block more EU sanctions against Russia and the like. So it's more difficult, of course, to absorb the Ukraine into the EU than NATO for all of these complicated legal and economic reasons. But NATO is not proposing to transform itself to have Ukraine as a member. The EU is, and I think that is the vital difference.
Another key plank of Zelensky's victory plan, as far as we're aware, but this seems pretty likely, is this use of long-range missiles inside Russia and permission to be able to use them. We didn't get any big announcements on that last week. Do you think that is likely to happen at some point?
It doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon, James. The Biden administration seems to have sort of dug in on this one. My understanding is that the US administration is pretty divided. You get people in the State Department very supportive of Ukraine who feel that this is a risk worth taking. James, the arguments. Putin has come up with these red lines before on F-16s and tanks and HIMARS artillery, and we've crossed those red lines. And what has Putin done? Nothing. So he's a bit of a paper tiger. And he'll use rhetoric to try to deter us, but in reality, we can go ahead. And in any case, if Ukraine is going to win, it means taking more risks. There's no way around that. And that Ukraine has sort of shown that it's very good at attacking targets deep inside Russia linked with the Russian military campaign. Fuel dumps, some spectacular explosions against ammunition dumps in recent days, striking at airfields, destroying Russian aircraft and bombers on airfields, all of the kind of things that make it harder for Russia to keep the offensive going. But there are people in the National Security Council and in the Pentagon who believe, we shouldn't sort of test Putin too much. There may be a red line that Putin is really going to keep, and which won't become a pink line, but it will remain a red line if we use those long-range artillery, long-range missiles. This is basically a step too far, and we shouldn't sort of go there, because we will then look as if we are directly entering the war. You've got to remember, James, too, that this is the run-up, of course, to the US elections. The last thing that Biden wants, which would sink the chances of Kamala Harris in the elections, is then a confrontation between the United States and Russia, in the same way that the US is trying to keep out of a war with Iran in the Middle East at the moment. Trump will masquerade as the peace president against Biden and Harris, the war presidents, if you like. So that context, I think, plays into it. So I think all of this is delaying things. The Ukrainians were sort of hoping that Biden would sort of give this authority while he was still in the White House, because things would be more uncertain afterwards. So what is happening is that Ukrainians are now falling back on plan B, which is to use their own domestically produced missiles and drones to do the job instead. And they've had some success. I mean, they've flown an armed drone 2,500 kilometers from Ukraine to Tomsk in Siberia to attack a Russian airfield. And I mentioned some of those other strikes that we've seen in recent days. So, and they've announced that they've developed their own long-range ballistic missile as well. Their defense industry is capable of producing these things. So I think plan B is that they will ask for money to invest with, and also materials and expertise in their domestic missile industry to produce the things themselves. And what they're actually asking is, look, we can produce these things, but we can't buy them. The government does not have the money to buy them. So America, will you buy these things that we produce ourselves so that we can use them ourselves with a Ukrainian flag on them? But of course, this takes time, and it doesn't. It's not as, for the Ukrainians, as convenient as having, of course, US JSOMs or ATACMS missiles arriving tomorrow, which they can use immediately. But on this long-range issue, we seem to be stuck. I mean, the British and the French seem more willing to go ahead. The UK with the Storm Shadow missile, the French with the Scout. But these weapons contain American components, and they need to have the permission of the United States. And I think, James, final point, sorry for this long response, but I think the final point on this is that, when you do these risky things, it's good if the Americans do them as well, as with the tanks or with the F-16 pilot training and so on, because then, safety in numbers, right? And it's an open question whether the British and the French would be willing to go ahead without Washington being in the game as well. Sorry for that long answer.
No, absolutely fascinating. And just finally on what we believe is in Zelensky's victory plan, I suppose the two other key pillars are a sustained deal for military aid, because it's been very stop-start. It's been, okay, give us the F-16s, and months of debate over it, then finally the F-16s are given, making sure it's a more sustainable sort of amount of aid, but also just more economic aid generally, because as you mentioned, okay, Ukraine can produce some of its own material, but it needs the money to do so.
Absolutely. Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, takes over as Secretary General of NATO tomorrow, and I think his first and biggest task is going to get this new NATO centre at Wiesbaden in Germany up and running, which was agreed at the NATO summit that I referred to in July, whereby NATO is now going to play this much more central coordinating role, dealing with the problems that you outlined, a more regular flow, not this sort of feast one moment, famine the next approach to delivering weapons. Ukraine is now operating about 140 different types of weapon system supplied by the West, because we've been giving them what we could spare rather than what they need. And this means 140 different types of training, 140 different spare parts and supply lines. It's completely chaotic. There needs to be a lot more standardization around certain weapon systems, and also ensuring that the training is there when the weapons arrive, getting them into Ukraine in a timely way. And so we need to see that that new NATO center is going to make a difference. For the time being, also the focus is on the non-controversial stuff that everybody agrees, Patriot systems for air defense, because clearly the Russian objective this winter will be to rip apart the Ukrainian energy grid. About 80% of the coal and oil, gas-fired stations are offline at the moment because of those strikes. And if it's a bad winter for the Ukrainians because of the energy issue, the number of Ukrainians calling for peace already increasing will increase further, and the number of Ukrainians fleeing to the west as refugees, already over 6 million, will also increase further. Nobody disagrees with air defense, but getting it into Ukraine quickly is going to be key. The other thing, James, is that the Ukrainians have now got manpower problems, severe manpower problems. They claim that for every soldier that is killed on their side, 6 are killed on the Russian side. That may be true, but they're a smaller army, a smaller population. And it's quite clear that they're now having problems. 10% of the army has apparently deserted. The younger Ukrainians, knowing what's going to happen to them, are less willing to be called up than the army that Ukraine had a few years ago. There are reports that Ukrainian lines are breaking now vis-a-vis the Russian onslaught because the Ukrainian conscripts have not had enough training before they are deployed. So another big task, I think, is really going to help Ukraine with the training of the soldiers so that they can hold the line. On the economic front, you're right. They only fund about 40% of their state budget at the moment, so they need that extra funding. The good news is that over the summer, the G7 countries agreed to confiscate the interest on Russian bank assets to use as collateral to give Ukraine a $50 billion loan. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President in Kiev last week, said we can already give you 35 billion of this on trust. So for the time being, that budget financing seems to be there. But again, if this goes on for years and years, and every year you have to come up with these enormous financial packages, it's going to be harder and harder naturally.
One of the other big headlines from last week was Vladimir Putin seemingly revising the Russian nuclear doctrine, saying that they would treat an attack by a non-nuclear state that has support from a nuclear state as equivalent to an attack from a nuclear state. What do you make of that?
Well, it's sort of going back to the Cold War, where nuclear powers had that kind of doctrine, so that people couldn't hide behind nuclear powers in alliances. And it's obviously a regrettable step, and it's been condemned by the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and by Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, predictably, because since the end of the Cold War, we were going towards a situation where the nuclear powers, including Russia, were recognizing more restraints on nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons would only be used against other nuclear states and as second strike retaliatory weapons, but nobody would use them first. It's not clear at the moment what's going to happen materially speaking, because although Russia has transferred some nuclear weapons to Belarus, there are no signs yet that it's put its existing nuclear weapons on higher alert. But I think two things. Frankly, the Russians see that this nuclear rhetoric is working. They see, we spoke about this a moment ago, the Biden administration hesitating about the long-range missiles because of fear of Russian retaliation. And so if it's a winning strategy in terms of intimidating your adversaries and getting them to back down, why not keep it going? And you see not just Putin, but all of the Russian senior leaders, like Lavrov, the foreign minister at the UN General Assembly last week, banging on about this nuclear issue. They think they've got the West on the back foot on this. The second problem, I think, is not so much the Russian nuclear doctrine, but Russian nuclear proliferation. I mentioned they've transferred weapons to Belarus. There's now talk that they're giving nuclear expertise and satellite technology to North Korea to improve its capabilities. They've just said that they support North Korea being a nuclear weapons state. That's total contradiction with resolutions that Russia has signed up to in the United Nations. There's talk about giving nuclear re-entry vehicle technology to Iran in exchange for Iran giving some of its drones and short-range weapons to Russia. So Russia, unfortunately, risks becoming a serial nuclear proliferator on the international scene. making a lot of far less reliable countries, much more nuclear capable for short-term, strategic gains. And the West is going to have to sort of live with that more dangerous multi-nuclear world for a long time to come. That is what I see as the real issue at the moment.
What is your sense, Jamie, of what we're seeing on the front line at the moment, both in terms of in the east of Ukraine, but also in Kursk as well? And I've heard some people say, look, you can call the Kursk incursion so far a tactical victory. What we don't know yet is whether it turns into something bigger, whether it's going to be a strategic victory for Ukraine or not. What is your sense of things?
Well, I've got to be honest. I'm a supporter of Ukraine, but I have to say it's not looking good at the moment. You're right. I mean, the Kursk incursion in August was a great tactical move, but the problem is that it doesn't seem to have worked yet in forcing the Russians to withdraw significant numbers of their forces from Ukraine to defend Kursk, thereby taking the pressure off the Ukrainians. It has had some effect. I mean, there are reports that the Russians, for example, have halted their advance towards Zaporizhzhia to take some forces back into Russia, but not when it comes to pushing against towns like Podkrovsk or Vuhledar in Donetsk, which they're still hoping to take in coming weeks. They're not advancing spectacularly, but they are advancing. And so that is the first point. Strategically, that idea of a move which would force Russia to change its own strategy isn't working. The second thing is that the Ukrainians have, of course, taken a lot of their best troops out of their defensive front line to do that operation. And that means that they have to put more of the badly trained conscripts to replace them in the front line, who are not as capable of standing up to the Russians. The Ukrainians also have a difficult choice. If they decide to push further into Russia, to create an even bigger salient, that means using more troops. So I think they're in a difficult situation at the moment. The best thing that they could do would be to try to hang on to what they've got in the hope that this can be a bargaining chip in eventual peace negotiations to oblige Putin to give up more territory inside Russia itself, inside Ukraine itself, excuse me. The problem, though, James, historically, is it's very difficult to defeat Russia. I mean, you remember Napoleon went all of the way to Moscow in 1812 and he burnt the city down, but he still lost. And he was still forced out. I mean, Russia is so vast that even if you take a chunk of territory, and the Germans in the Second World War proved this too, in terms of strategic defeat of Russia, it doesn't sort of get you very far. The Russians can afford to do this. It happened to them also in the First World War, and ultimately bounce back. It would be much more effective in a small European country than it is in Russia.
You mentioned Mark Rutte taking over from Jens Stoltenberg this week as the new NATO Secretary General. An enormous in-tray, to say the least. Just give us a sense of the challenges he faces.
Well, first and foremost, James, as we spoke about a moment ago, he has this task of, getting this new NATO center in Wiesbaden up and running so that the Ukrainians do see a difference in terms of the regularity, the quality of the supply that they are going to be getting. NATO is now going to be sort of much more under pressure to perform in that respect. I think the second thing that I hope he would do would be to get his generals and his senior officials together and say, chaps, I've heard all of these war warnings from different generals, including people like Grant Shapps, the former UK defense minister, warning of a war with Russia in 5 years' time. Are we ready? If tomorrow something happened, could we basically defend our territory? I've seen, a lot of NATO exercises in recent months. I've seen, a build-up of forces in Central and Eastern Europe with NATO battalions. I've seen greater levels of defense spending. That's all very well. But what I want to know is, where are we in terms of our ability to do collective defense? I mean, I think what will be at the back of his mind is there have been a lot of incursions in recent days of Russian drones and some missiles into NATO territory. Accidental, probably, but you had a Ukrainian drone with a lot of explosives on it land in Latvia. If it had landed on a Latvian supermarket, NATO would have been in a very sticky position vis-a-vis collective defense. And so that clearly shows that in terms of air defense and the protection of NATO skies in Eastern Europe, there is work to be done. So I think that would be a key issue that he would need to address as well. He's also, of course, got to deal with defense spending. 20 23 allies out of the 32 are now meeting the 2% goal. But if you're President Trump, you're going to want that to be all 32 before you're satisfied with the European contribution. And so he's obviously going to have to do a lot of work to get some of those laggards up to the level as well. But James, I think finally, and more strategically, as he sort of looks at his 5-year term, he's going to have to sort of look at a kind of fork in the road. Is he going to be the advocate of a limited NATO, doing collective defense in Europe, focusing mainly on Russia, making sure that NATO territory remains sacrosanct, trying to help Ukraine, and keep it as basically a military alliance? Or is he going to say, well, recent NATO communiques have spoken a lot about China and the challenge of China. We are now looking much more at Ukraine, North Korea, Iran, Russia working together as a kind of new axis of the authoritarians, helping each other. We've got leaders from Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand turning up at NATO summits, arguing that Asia and Europe are a single common theatre and work together. So am I going to be the advocate of this kind of narrow military Russia-focused NATO, or am I going to go more in the direction which many in the United States would like, of a more global political NATO, dealing with the four together, as it were, the big four, and also taking China on, not in a military sense, but as a sort of technological, political, economic, strategic challenge. It'd be interesting to see, how he, in which direction he's going to steer the ship, although that may not be apparent immediately.
And just finally, Jamie, a brief word on Jens Stoltenberg, who's obviously coming to an end of his tenure.
Well, I think he played an excellent role keeping the family together. He probably made more trips to Washington to talk to Trump, or to Ankara to talk to Erdogan, or to Budapest to talk to the Hungarian leader than he wanted. But because, of course, he had some rebellious allies in the ranks. But he managed it. They all stayed on board. The Turks and the Hungarians did not finally block the entry of Finland and Sweden into NATO. Trump threatened, but ultimately did not do his worst. But it does show, I think, his successor, that you may think that you're going to spend a lot of time, traveling to Asia or part the countries in the Middle East or elsewhere. But still, with 32 allies, different interests from time to time, your job is to keep the family together. I think he played a good role there. I think he was a good cheerleader for Ukraine and for defense spending. And I think also part of his legacy will be developing those ties with those Asia-Pacific democracies, which do have a lot of potential for the future if NATO chooses to exploit that potential.
Dr. Jamie Shea, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.